It was a cold February morning in 1957. A young man was walking through a quiet, wooded area on the outskirts of northeast Philadelphia. He wasn't looking for anything unusual. He wasn't expecting anything unusual. He was just cutting through the brush the way he had done dozens of times before. But then he stopped. Partially hidden beneath a thicket of wild shrubs, half covered by a thin layer of frost, was a cardboard box. A J.C. Penney bassinet box, to be specific. The kind you'd expect to find at a dump site or blowing across an empty lot. Nothing about it should have been remarkable. Except something was sticking out from inside it. He moved closer. The frost crunched beneath his feet. The wind had gone still, the way it sometimes does in winter, like the world itself is holding its breath. And then he saw it. Inside that box, discarded like trash, left in the cold, hidden from the road, was the body of a small child. A little boy. He was naked. He was pale. He couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. His hair had been recently cut, unevenly, like someone had done it in a hurry. His tiny fingernails had been recently trimmed too. His blue eyes were half open, staring at nothing. No shoes. No clothes. No identification. No one had reported him missing. No one, it seemed, was even looking for him. For 6 to 5 years, this little boy had no name. He became known simply as America's unknown child. The boy in the box. A ghost that haunted an entire city, and then an entire nation, for generations. This is his story. And for the first time in history, it now has an ending. The date was February 25th, 1957. Philadelphia in February is a gray, bitter place. The trees are bare. The ground is hard. Most people don't linger outside any longer than they have to. The Fox Chase neighborhood, on the northeastern edge of the city, was quiet and semi-rural back then. There were open fields, patches of woodland, and stretches of road where you could walk for long minutes without seeing another person. The area near Susquehanna Road was exactly that kind of place. The young man who first stumbled upon the box actually chose not to report it immediately. This detail often gets overlooked, but it matters. He was checking on illegal muskrat traps he had set in the area, traps that were against local ordinances, and he was afraid that calling the police would get him in trouble. So he walked away. He walked away from a dead child. He carried that discovery with him for 24 hours before the weight of it became too much. He told his mother. And his mother, to her credit, insisted he do the right thing. On February 26, 1957, police received the call. When officers arrived at the scene, they found the box exactly as the young man had described it. A large cardboard bassinet box from J.C. Penney. Inside was the body of a young boy, estimated to be between 4 and 6 years old. He was completely naked. His body showed signs of physical trauma, bruising across his face, marks consistent with abuse. There were old scars on his body as well, suggesting this was not a single incident of violence, but a pattern. Someone had been hurting this child for a long time. The medical examiner was called. The boy was transported. And a case was opened that would become one of the most haunting, most investigated, and most heartbreaking unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. But first, investigators needed to answer the most basic question of all. Who was he? Despite having almost nothing to go on, investigators were able to piece together a few things from physical evidence. The boy was white. He had light brown hair that had been cut very recently, and not professionally. Whoever had cut it had done a poor job, snipping unevenly, almost like they were trying to change his appearance after death. His fingernails had also been recently clipped. This detail is significant. It suggests that whoever left him there was attempting, however clumsily, to groom the body before disposing of it. To make him look cared for, perhaps. Or to remove evidence from beneath his nails. His body showed signs of malnourishment. He was small for his estimated age. He had what appeared to be surgical scars, one consistent with a prior surgery to remove or examine something near the groin. He had a L-shaped scar on his chin. He had soft calluses on his hands and feet suggesting he had lived, but not necessarily worked hard. There were no signs of sexual abuse, which investigators noted. The cause of death, according to the medical examiner, was a blow to the head. Blunt force trauma. Someone had struck this child, and the blow had killed him. Or the sustained abuse had caused fatal injury. The exact mechanism was difficult to determine given the condition of the body. But there was no ambiguity about this. Someone had killed this boy. This was a homicide. The box he was found in, the J.C. Penney bassinet box, became one of the key pieces of evidence. Investigators traced it to a store in the area. The type of box was one that had been sold at a particular J.C. Penney location as a package with a baby bassinet. Detectives canvassed the store's sales records, interviewed employees, tried to trace who had purchased a bassinet recently enough to still have the box. It led nowhere. They also examined the plastic bag that had been placed beneath the boy in the box, a thin sheet of plastic, the kind used in dry cleaning or packaging. They attempted to trace it. Again, nowhere. The blanket that was draped partially over him came from a specific manufacturer. They traced it. They found where it was likely sold. They interviewed people. Dead ends at every turn. Whoever had left this boy here had been careful. Not professional. The haircut alone showed a degree of panic, of improvisation, but careful enough to leave almost nothing behind. Philadelphia homicide detectives threw significant resources at this case, particularly in the early weeks. They distributed flyers across the city with a composite sketch of the boy. They put his photo in newspapers. They contacted hospitals, schools, churches, and social services agencies. They sent alerts to neighboring states. They reached out to agencies across the country. Nobody came forward. Not a single person called to say they recognized the boy. Not a neighbor. Not a teacher. Not a relative. Not a family friend. In a city of millions, this child was invisible. He had no presence in any record that investigators could find. No birth certificate match. No school enrollment. No medical records that matched his physical profile. It was as if he had never existed. This invisibility itself told a story. It meant that this boy, for however long he had been alive, had been kept hidden. He had not been allowed to exist in the normal world. No school, no daycare, no church, no birthday parties, no neighbors who would wave at him from across the street. He had been isolated. And that isolation had allowed whoever was caring for him to abuse him without anyone ever knowing he existed. The investigators gave him a name for working purposes. They called him Joseph. Joseph, because he was a child who had been wrapped and left, discarded and forgotten. They buried him in a small grave at Ivy Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia. Local citizens, moved by the case, donated money for a proper headstone. It read, "Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy." For years, a woman named Remington Bristow, an employee of the medical examiner's office, became privately obsessed with the case. He spent 36 years of his life, his own money, his own time, trying to find out who this child was. He followed every lead. He visited foster homes. He tracked down bassinet box sales. He interviewed anyone who might know anything. He died in 1993 without ever finding the answer. But he never gave up. And his dedication inspired others to keep trying long after most people had moved on. One of the most persistent theories in the case involved a foster care facility not far from where the body was found. There was a foster home in the area, a property that housed multiple children at a time, run by a couple who had been investigated previously for the treatment of children in their care. Remington Bristow visited this property multiple times over the years. He noted similarities between items found near the body and items on the property. He believed, strongly, that this home was connected to the boy's death. But belief without evidence is not enough to charge anyone. The couple at the center of this theory denied any knowledge of the boy. No child in their care was reported missing around that time that matched his description. Investigators looked into their records and could not produce enough to build a case. The woman at the center of it died without ever being charged. Her name, and the names of others investigated over the years, have been raised and dismissed multiple times. The foster home theory remained just that, a theory. What investigators did not have, and would not have for decades, was the technology to go further. The case never officially closed. Homicide cases in Pennsylvania do not expire. But in practical terms, as the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, and the 1960s to the 1970s, the active investigation slowed. The detectives who had worked the case originally retired or died. The files were maintained, but the momentum faded. The boy in the box, however, did not fade from public memory. He became something of a Philadelphia institution, not in any celebratory sense, but in the way that unresolved grief becomes part of a city's identity. People left flowers at his grave. School children learned about him. Local journalists revisited the case every few years, usually around the anniversary of his discovery. He was America's unknown child. And every year that passed without an answer made that title feel more permanent, more devastating. In the 1990s, with the rise of forensic science and DNA technology, Renewed interest brought renewed hope. The medical examiner's office had preserved biological material from the original examination. In 1998, a facial reconstruction was created, a three-dimensional model of what the boy might have looked like in life, and it was widely distributed. Still, no identification. In 2019, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children created a new, updated forensic reconstruction using modern techniques. The image was striking. A round-faced, soft-featured little boy with light eyes and a gentle expression. They distributed it again. News outlets picked it up. The story went viral, because by 2019, the internet could carry a story in ways that 1957 never could. People across the country shared the image. Tips poured in. Each one was investigated. None of them panned out. It seemed like the boy's identity would never be known. Something important to understand about this case is the human element that kept it alive for so long. Over the decades, volunteers, regular citizens with no official role in the investigation, took it upon themselves to maintain his grave and keep his memory alive. A group called the Vidocq Society, a Philadelphia-based organization of criminologists and forensic experts, formally took on the case in 1998 and contributed significant resources and expertise to the investigation. Members of this group visited his grave regularly. They brought flowers. They sat with him. On his headstone, the inscription had been updated over the years. Eventually it would read, "America's Unknown Child." Beside the grave, visitors left toys, pinwheels, balloons, stuffed animals. For a child who had been discarded in a box, there was something achingly poignant about a grave that overflowed with the gifts of strangers. He mattered to people who never knew him. He always had. This is part of what makes the case so different from other cold cases. It was never just about solving a crime, though that mattered enormously. It was about restoring the identity of a human being who had been erased. It was about saying, "You were real. You existed. You deserved better. We are sorry for what happened to you." By the early 2020s, forensic genetic genealogy had transformed cold case investigations across the United States. This technology works like this. Investigators extract DNA from biological material, in cold cases, often from bones or teeth, and they build a genetic profile. That profile is then uploaded to consumer genealogy databases, places where millions of ordinary people have submitted their own DNA to learn about their ancestry. By comparing the unknown profile to the profiles in those databases, investigators can identify distant relatives of the unknown person, a third cousin here, a second cousin there. From those relatives, they build a family tree. They trace the branches. And eventually, if the science holds, they arrive at a name. This is the same technology that identified the Golden State Killer in 2018. It's the same technology that has since identified dozens of Jane and John Does across the country. In 2019, the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office partnered with Othram, a DNA technology company based in Texas that specializes in forensic-grade genome sequencing. They extracted DNA from the boy's remains. They built a profile. And then they waited. And they searched. And they cross-referenced. The process took years. The genealogy work was painstaking. Building a family tree from distant cousins is not quick work. It requires corroborating public records, census data, birth and death certificates, marriage records, immigration records, military records. It requires ruling out branches that don't fit. It requires patience and expertise in equal measure. But slowly, the tree took shape. Investigators began to narrow in on a family. A particular family from the Philadelphia area. A family that had, in the 1950s, included a young child. A young child who, by all available evidence, had stopped appearing in records around early 1957. They had a lead. A real lead. Possibly the most significant lead the case had ever seen. Now they needed confirmation. In 2023, 65 years after a young man found a cardboard box in the frost of a February morning, the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office made an announcement. The boy had been identified. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. He had been born on January 13, 1953. He would have been 4 years old when he died. He died sometime in or around February 1957. The name Joseph, the name investigators had given him all those years ago, the name on his grave marker, the name that Philadelphia had whispered for decades, turned out to be, by extraordinary coincidence, almost exactly right. His real name was Joseph. The identification had come through forensic genealogy. Othram's work, combined with the genealogical research conducted by investigative genealogist Dr. Ellen Grippy, had traced the boy's DNA to a specific family. Living relatives of Joseph were identified and voluntarily provided DNA samples to confirm the match. The match was conclusive. Joseph Augustus Zarelli was real. He had a name. He had a birthday. He had a family, though what kind of family, and what exactly happened to him, remained questions for investigators to answer. The announcement was made on December 8, 2022, with formal confirmation following in 2023. Philadelphia wept. People who had visited his grave for decades, who had left toys and flowers and pinwheels for a child they never knew, now had a name to speak aloud. Journalists who had covered the case for their entire careers sat in silence watching the press conference. Former investigators who were still alive heard the news and cried. He had a name. After 65 years. He had a name. The identification of Joseph's name was only one part of the answer. The other part, perhaps the more important part, was still being pieced together. Who were his parents? What had happened to him? Who was responsible for his death? Investigators were careful not to disclose too much publicly, citing the ongoing nature of the investigation. The identities of his parents and other family members were not officially released. But what became clear from subsequent reporting was that Joseph's family had been known to exist in the Philadelphia area during the relevant time period. His parents were alive, at some point, during the 1950s. His existence had been, for whatever reason, largely hidden from official records. There was no birth certificate in Pennsylvania's records under his name, or if there was, investigators had not yet been able to conclusively match it. This is consistent with the theory that Joseph had been kept off the grid, deliberately excluded from the systems that would normally document a child's existence. Why? That question still had no complete answer. What investigators could say was this: someone in Joseph's life had known what happened to him. Someone had been present at the time of his death. Someone had taken the time to cut his hair and clip his fingernails. Someone had placed him in a box and driven to a wooded area and left him there in the cold. That person, or those people, may have known that they were being sought. They may have spent the rest of their lives carrying this secret. Some of them, statistically, have since died. Others may still be alive. The investigation remained open. Even before the identification, the physical evidence in the case had always pointed toward a specific kind of story. Joseph had been malnourished, but not starved. He had been cared for, at least minimally. Someone had fed him. Someone had clothed him at some point, even if he was naked when he died. The surgical scar on his body suggested he had, at some point, received medical care, which meant someone had taken him to a doctor, which meant someone was legally responsible for him. But that same person, or someone in that same household, had also hurt him repeatedly. The old scars, the bruising, the marks consistent with ongoing abuse. These things do not happen without a perpetrator who has ongoing access to a child. Everything about this case pointed to a household, a closed household, a family, biological or chosen, that had kept Joseph hidden and had, eventually, caused his death. Whether the fatal blow was deliberate or the culmination of sustained abuse was unclear. But the result was the same: a 4-year-old boy ended up dead, and the people responsible for him chose to hide that rather than seek help or face consequences. They chose a cardboard box over the truth. This case is unusual not just because of its length. 6 to 5 years is an almost incomprehensible span of time for a murder to go unsolved, but because of the number of ordinary people who simply refused to let it die. Remington Bristow spent 36 years of his life on this case. He wasn't a detective anymore. He was a worker at the medical examiner's office who became personally invested in a child he never knew. He spent his own money. He drove his own car. He knocked on his own doors. He died without an answer, but the work he did kept the case alive and preserved information that would later prove valuable. The Vidocq Society formally adopted the case in 1998 and brought forensic expertise and resources to bear in a sustained way that the police department alone could not have maintained. Samuel Weinstein, a forensic artist, created facial reconstructions that were distributed nationally and kept the boy's face in the public consciousness. The citizens of Philadelphia who donated money for his original headstone. The anonymous visitors who left toys at his grave every year. The journalists who re-examined the case every February 25th. The true crime researchers who built databases of leads and cross-references. None of these people were paid to care about Joseph Zarelli. None of them were required to. They simply could not look away from an injustice this complete, this devastating, this personal. A child had been thrown away, and ordinary people refused to let the world forget it. That refusal, ultimately, is part of what made the identification possible. Because when Othram and the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office began their work with forensic genealogy, they were building on a foundation that had been laid across 6 decades by dozens of people who kept the case alive when it could easily have been forgotten. It's worth spending more time on the science, because it represents something genuinely remarkable. Forensic genetic genealogy begins with DNA, but not the kind of DNA most people think of from crime dramas. It's not about finding a suspect's DNA at a scene and matching it to a database of criminals. This technology works in reverse. You have an unknown person, and you're trying to figure out who they are. The DNA extracted from Joseph's remains was, after 6 to 5 years, degraded. Working with degraded ancient DNA requires different techniques than working with fresh samples. Othram's process involves a method called forensic-grade genome sequencing, which essentially rebuilds the genetic profile from fragmented material, piece by piece, filling in gaps through computational methods. Once a genetic profile is built, it gets uploaded to databases like GEDmatch or FamilyTree DNA, where millions of people have voluntarily submitted their own DNA. The algorithm looks for shared segments, stretches of genetic code that indicate shared ancestry. A match with a first cousin is obvious. A match with a third or fourth cousin is much more subtle, just a small fragment of shared DNA across a vast genetic distance. But even those small matches are useful if you know how to work with them. Genealogist Dr. Ellen Grippy, who worked on this case, describes the process as building a puzzle from the outside in. You start with the distant relatives you can identify, the third cousins and fourth cousins who have no idea they're connected to a cold case, and you build outward and inward simultaneously. You trace their trees forward and backward in time, through census records, through vital records, through immigration files, through anything that documents the movement of people through history. And slowly, sometimes over months, sometimes over years, the trees converge. The branches touch. And at the center of the convergence, there is a name. In Joseph's case, the convergence pointed to a family. A real family, with real records, with real people who are still alive. People who share Joseph's DNA. People who, by the nature of that connection, know something about who he was and where he came from. Whether those people know the full story of what happened to Joseph, and whether they are willing or able to share it, is a question that investigators are still working to answer. When the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office announced that the boy in the box had been identified as Joseph Augustus Zarelli, it marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The end of the chapter of not knowing. Of an unknown child lying in a grave with no name. Of a city holding a grief it couldn't fully articulate because the grief had no object, no name to attach to it, no family to offer condolences to, no story to fully tell. Joseph had a name now. That mattered enormously, for reasons that go beyond the legal or the investigative. It mattered because identity is a fundamental human dignity. To be known, to be named, to be counted as someone who existed and who mattered. These are things that every human being deserves. Joseph had been denied those things in life. The identification gave them back to him, even in death. But the other chapter, the chapter of accountability, of justice, was just beginning. Knowing Joseph's name meant that investigators could now focus their attention on the specific people in his life. His parents, any other adults in his household, anyone who had been present in the days and weeks before his death, anyone who had known he existed and had said nothing after he disappeared. The challenge, of course, is time. 6 to 5 years is an eternity in investigative terms. Most of the adults who were alive in 1957 and who might have been connected to Joseph are now dead. Witnesses are gone. Memories have faded or been deliberately suppressed. Evidence, physical evidence, is almost entirely gone. What investigators have is the DNA record, the genealogical tree, the names it points toward, and whatever living relatives may know or be willing to share. Whether a prosecution will ever be possible, whether anyone will ever stand in a courtroom and answer for what happened to Joseph Augustus Zarelli, is deeply uncertain. But for many of the people who have worked this case, and for many of the citizens of Philadelphia who have followed it for decades, a prosecution was never entirely the point. The point was the name. The point was, he was real. His life mattered. The world should know who he was. Joseph Augustus Zarelli is buried at Ivy Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia. For most of the 6 to 5 years since his body was found, his headstone bore the inscription America's Unknown Child. Visitors, strangers, all of them, left toys and flowers and photographs. They sat beside him. They talked to him. They told him that someone remembered. After the identification, the cemetery and the city began the process of updating his memorial, of giving him, finally, a grave that bore his real name. Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Born January 13, 1953. Died February 1957. 4 years old. There is something almost unbearable about putting those words in sequence. Born in January 1953. Discovered dead in February 1957. 4 years. That was all he had. 4 years in a world that, by all available evidence, was not kind to him. 4 years during which he was hidden, isolated, hurt, and ultimately killed. And yet, he was remembered. Across 6 decades, by thousands of people who never knew him. By a city that kept his memory alive. By investigators and volunteers and ordinary citizens who simply refused to let a child be forgotten. That, too, is part of his story. Not just the horror of what happened to him, but the extraordinary human response to it. The refusal to look away. The insistence that even a child with no name, no record, and no visible family deserved to be known and mourned and sought. Even with the identification in hand, many questions about Joseph's case remain unanswered. Who killed him? Investigators have not publicly named a suspect. The identification of Joseph's family has given them a narrowed focus, but no arrest has been made as of the time of this video. Where had he been living? The house, the neighborhood, the specific circumstances of his daily life. None of this has been made fully public. Who took him to the doctor? The surgical scar suggests a medical procedure at some point. Medical records, if they still exist, could provide significant information. Who cut his hair after he died? This act, frantic, unskilled, performed on a dead child, speaks to someone in a state of panic. Someone trying to fix something that could not be fixed. Someone who knew what they had done. Why the box? Why that location? Why that time of year? Was it chosen deliberately, or was it simply convenient? Were there other children? Investigators have never publicly indicated that Joseph was part of a larger pattern of abuse involving multiple children, but the question has been raised over the years. What did his life look like? Was he ever happy? Did he ever play outside? Did anyone ever hold him and tell him they loved him? These last questions have no investigative value. They cannot lead to a prosecution or a conviction. But they are the questions that people ask, because Joseph was not just a case, he was a child. And when we look at the photograph of that reconstruction, the soft round face, the light eyes, the expression of a boy who might have been shy, or curious, or sweet, we cannot help but wonder who he might have been, what he might have liked, what might have made him laugh. On a cold February morning in 1957, a young man found a cardboard box in the woods on the edge of Philadelphia. Inside that box was a little boy. He had no name. He had no record. He had no one looking for him. He had been hidden from the world for all of his short life, and whoever had hidden him had hoped, perhaps, that the world would go on not noticing. They were wrong. Philadelphia noticed. America noticed. And for 6 to 5 years, the world refused to forget a child who had been thrown away. Through the work of detectives and volunteers, forensic scientists and genealogists, journalists and ordinary citizens who left flowers at a grave, through all of that sustained, collective refusal to accept that this boy didn't matter, an answer finally came. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. He was 4 years old. He deserved better than the life he was given. He deserved better than the death he suffered. He deserved to have his name spoken aloud in the world, and to be mourned the way every child deserves to be mourned. He has that now. It took 6 to 5 years. It took technology that didn't exist when he died. It took people who were not yet born when his body was found. But it happened. Joseph Augustus Zarelli is no longer unknown. He is remembered. He is named. And somewhere in the records of Philadelphia, in the files of detectives who are still working to answer the question of who is responsible for his death, his name is written. Not the boy in the box. Not America's unknown child. Not Joseph. The placeholder name given by investigators who hoped it might one day be replaced. Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Say his name. If you found this video valuable, please subscribe and share it. These stories deserve to be told, and the people in them, especially the children, deserve to be remembered. We'll be back soon with another case.